Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice and bright outside finally, but it is chilly. Today we're discussing the first time home buyers rebate that the government has announced, and I will let David explain, but I'm thinking this is for more for pre-con, David, than
Yes. Yes.
than regulars. I know that it doesn't say on the topic, but this is specifically for pre-con presently. And yeah, it's a really interesting topic. It's part of the new rules and regulations that the federal government is rolling out to benefit buyers, and I think also benefit the builders. But I'll let David explain the whole thing. And yeah, it's a great topic. We will be recording it, so if you miss out on anything, the recording will be there on our YouTube channel. And of course, you have formants to help you through the process of showing your clients the right route. So over to you, David.
Okay. Thanks, Sabiha, and thanks everybody that's joining us live today. Thanks for attending, and I hope there'll be many that'll see the recorded version of this too, and you get some information on this. This is something new, so it's always fun to tell you about something new. But as I've stated in the past, when we're telling you about new legislation coming to force, first of all, don't shoot the messenger. Okay, this isn't my drafting, it's not my creation. There's some issues in this, and some of it hasn't been implemented. And I'll give you the information and tell you what we know so far and try and explain it the best I can. So, this is the first time home buyers GST HST rebate. So, we'll get into our little slide presentation. I'll skip through some of our introductory slides that most of you have seen many, many times. Oh, you know what? I'm using the wrong version. We have an updated version of this that actually has a new picture. So I should have brought that up for today. So we have updated. But this is a topic of David and I have already done on our podcast. So you can please check that out. Um, and please let us know if you want to be a guest. And we're happy to we're always looking for guests and new topics and things. So give us some feedback on the David and David in Real Estate whenever you get a chance. So this was introduced back in May of 2025. So it's not that far off from, it's almost a year already. I guess we're only at the end of February, but it's 12 months ago or whatever. Federal government, okay, after the election, tabled this legislation to amend the Excise Act to introduce this first-time home buyers GST-HST rebate. So just to explain to you a little bit about the Excise Tax Act is the act that governs HST. And the act basically says HST is payable for
Buenos días.
everything
Buenos días. Así quedamos
you
entonces.
everything you buy, services, etc. You pay HST on everything. And there's a federal component to it, to the HST, and there's a provincial component. There's GST and there's HST. But anyways, you're basically paying HST for everything unless there's an exception. Now, most of you realtors that are used to doing resale transactions, you know that HST is not payable on the purchase price on resale used residential properties. Okay. And the reason for that is because it's an exemption in the Excise Tax Act. So HST is payable unless there's an exemption. Okay. The sale of used residential property happens to be one of the exemptions or exceptions in the Excise Tax Act. Now, that does not apply to new construction or pre-construction, like Sabiha said. Okay. So there is no exemption for HST for pre-construction for brand new properties, residential properties. So that means that HST is payable. Okay. So HST is payable. So the way builders generally deal with it in their agreements of purchase and sale is they generally market their new construction with a purchase price that includes HST. Okay, so if they're selling it for $1 million we're going to review the agreement, and most of the time that agreement's going to say that the $1 million purchase price is inclusive of HST. So when the builder receives the $1 million, they're going to be paying HST to the government on it. Okay. But from a buyer's point of view, the HST is included. It's one of the things we're always looking for in an agreement of purchase when we review it, just to make sure that it in fact says that. Because if it doesn't say that, HST would be in addition to the purchase price because it's still going to be payable. And then they'd have to collect from the buyer the million plus the HST, the 13%. So they're repaying that additional amount to the builder on closing, and the government's still going to get paid the HST. So HST is payable. So now the government was trying to find a way to add some incentive and give first-time home buyers a bit of a break. So they were going to create, so this proposed legislation to create this first-time home buyers HST rebate. Okay, GST HST rebate. So um, there has to the home buyer has to be eligible for this rebate, and this is totally separate and apart from the GST HST new housing rebate, which has been around for a long time and is still around. It's not being repealed or anything. That still exists. Okay. Now, for that GST HST new housing rebate, that's applicable to anybody buying new construction, not a first-time home buyer. And that's a rebate because there's a certain amount of the HST is payable in accordance with the agreement of purchase and sale. And what typically has there's usually typically a provision in the agreement that says the buyer is making a representation. They're eligible to apply for that new housing rebate. They apply for it, and they also agree to assign that new housing rebate to the builder. So the builder will get the benefit of that rebate. If the buyer doesn't qualify for that new housing rebate, the buyer agrees to pay the builder an amount equal to that new housing rebate to the builder in addition to the purchase price on closing. That still exists. That's not affected in any way by this. So that new housing rebate will still be applicable. Nothing's changed there. This is different. Okay. Now, it's important for you to note that this is proposed legislation. It has not received final royal assent. It is not the law yet. Okay. This has been going on since the end of May 2025. We're 12 months later. It's not the law yet. We're not sure exactly when it's going to come in, if they decide to change it, if they amend it. We don't know what the regulations look like. The timing for this, we're not sure about any of that, but I'm going to keep going and tell you what's in this proposed legislation that we know of. Okay. So I already mentioned HSTs usually included in the purchase price. And when you're reviewing green purchase sale or we're reviewing it as a lawyer, that's critical. We're always looking to make sure that it in fact says that. Okay. Now, I did mention that HST isn't payable on used residential property because it's an exception or an exemption under the Excise Tax Act. But there's always an exception to an exception. And if it's a used residential property, but it has been a substantially renovated property, then it's treated like new construction under the Excise Tax Act, and HST could be payable. Okay. And there's certain thresholds that you have to go through and the facts to determine whether or not it crossed the line of being a substantially renovated property, which would trigger HST. Okay. So bottom line is we have to review an agreement of purchase and sale. Okay. You should be reviewing it, but you should also make sure that the lawyer acting for your client is reviewing it. We want to make sure that it says HST is included in the purchase price, etc. We want to see what it says. Now, I mentioned there's GST and there's HST. The GST is the federal portion, okay, which is the 5%. So the federal portion is 5% of the overall 13% of the HST, and the provincial portion is the other 8% of the HST. So what's being proposed under this federal legislation, because this is a federal law, not a provincial law, so it applies to all of Canada, is that there'll be an elimination of the GST portion of the HST. So HST is payable on this new construction, but there's this first-time home buyer rebate, which means the GST portion would not be payable. So it's a 5% savings to a buyer. Not the full 13%, it's just 5% because it's just the federal portion. So it reduces the effective cost to a buyer by 5%, which is significant. Okay, 13% would be better, but it's 5%. That's what's available right now. Okay, so the whole idea is that's going to add some incentive to first-time home buyers to buy new construction properties because they can get a 5% advantage by doing it once this law comes into effect when they otherwise wouldn't have that 5% advantage. So he has to be eligible to qualify for this rebate. Okay, first issue of eligibility is you got to be buying your first home. First time home buyer. First time. First time. Okay. Doesn't mean your first time buying any property or buying a home or buying a new construction home because you previously owned a resale home. You have to be a first time home buyer. Okay. Now the property itself has to be newly built. Okay. But this would also qualify to a resale type of property that has been substantially renovated because it'll be treated just like it would attract HST because it's been substantially renovated, even though it's not brand new, but it's been substantially renovated, it would attract HST. So on the same logic, it should also be eligible for the first-time home buyer rebate if it's a first-time buyer buying that substantially renovated property. Instead of paying 13% HST on that in addition to their purchase price, they would only be paying 8% because they get this 5% rebate. Okay. So it's got to be newly built or substantially renovated property, and the property has to be bought as the individual's primary place of residence. So if they already have a primary place of residence, it's not going to qualify. If it's an investment property, it's not going to qualify. Okay. Now, depending on the value of the home, the individual could recover up to 100% of the GST paid up to $50,000. So they do put a ceiling on this. So we have to do a calculation each time to determine how much is going to be recoverable in terms of the rebate because you can't recover more than 50,000. So for new homes valued up to $1 million, the rebate would be up to 100%. Okay, if it's between 1 million and 1.5 million, the maximum rebate would gradually be reduced. And once you're above 1.5 million in purchase price, even though it's new construction, you really qualify, there would be no rebate. So it's really giving people at the lower end of the market, and I hate to talk about people spending $1.5 million to buy a home at the lower end of the market, but that's what they're trying to do to encourage people, okay, for that. So that's the way it's proposed so far. So there is this graduation that we have to determine based on a purchase price to determine the actual amount of the rebate that they might get. So who's considered a first-time home buyer? Okay, because we got to be very careful to make sure that someone is eligible. So for the purposes of this legislation and be eligible for the rebate, you have to meet certain conditions to qualify as a first-time home buyer and get the benefit of the rebate. You got to be at least 18 years old. You have to be either a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident of Canada. So if you're not either of those, you're not going to be eligible for this rebate. So if you're just applying to become a citizen or a permanent, you're not going to be eligible because you're not a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. And the third criteria is you must have not lived in a home, whether in or outside Canada, that they own, that the person applying, for eligibility would have owned, or that their spouse or common law partner owned in the calendar year or the preceding 4 calendar years. Okay, so I know this gets a little bit confusing, and we don't always have black and white answers. We have to look at the actual facts to make sure that somebody qualifies as a first-time home buyer by addressing each of these points and the actual facts. Are they 18 years old? Are they Canadian citizen or PR? Have they lived in a home? It doesn't matter if it's inside or Canada. It has to be they've lived in a home. and whether they owned it or their spouse or common law partner owned it, and when did they own it, when did they live in it, in what time period. We got to look at all the facts to determine the eligibility. Okay. So we have to go through all of those checkpoints. Now, it's not going to be available for all property types. It will be available, the rebate will be available to the same types of housing that the current new housing rebate is available to. So they haven't really changed that. So if you're eligible, if the property was eligible for a GST, HST new housing rebate, then it would also be eligible for the FTHB rebate. Okay. And it basically is excluding commercial properties. It's residential properties to be living in. So it would include detached homes, semis, duplexes, condominium units, townhouses, uh,
Hello.
units in a co-op, and mobile homes, floating homes, things like that. Okay, so it's the same criteria that's used for eligibility. And the new housing rebate is also used in the first-time home buyer rebate. So nothing really changed there. Now, to qualify, the home has to be purchased from builder. Okay, to qualify for the rebate, at least one of the buyers of the home would need to be a first-time home buyer that's acquiring the new home for as their primary place of residence. Not all, but at least one of the buyers. Okay. So there could be more than one buyer. At least one has to be acquiring it for their principal residence. Okay. That individual would also need to be the first individual to occupy as a place of residence. So if someone would otherwise qualify and be eligible for this rebate, but they decide not to move in first, they want to rent it out first for a couple months or something like that, they're going to not be eligible for this rebate because they won't be the first individual to occupy the home as their place of residence. Okay. Now, when the agreement of purchase and sale is entered into, will be a factor in here as well. So the rebate should be available if the agreement of purchase sale for the home is entered into with the builder on or after May 27, 2025, which is the date that this legislation was first proposed. So if an agreement was signed before that date, because nobody knew about this rebate because it hadn't been announced yet, that property and that transaction would not qualify. So it's any agreements that were entered into on or after May 27 of last year. And then they put an outside date for whatever reason. It has to be signed before 2031. So I guess the intent of the legislation is going to just be applicable for new construction during that time period. And then when we get to 2031, it's going to end unless the government changes their mind and passes something else or changes the legislation or passes an extension or something. But right now there's an end date that we don't really have to worry about right now. But the key is when was the agreement of purchase sale signed? Okay. Now there's another criteria is they want the construction to actually begin. So you got to sign an agreement after May 27, 2025, but the construction has to begin before 2031. It doesn't have to be finished. You don't have to close before 2031. Okay. But it has to begin before 2031 and it has to be substantially completed before 2036. Okay. Now that's a long time off. That's 10 years away and governments may come and go in the meantime. And there could be further amendments before we ever get to those dates. Okay. So that's what's proposed so far. Okay. So, we're going to be looking for eligibility for agreements that were signed after this legislation was proposed, even though the legislation is not in effect yet. But at some point, if they decide to make it effective tomorrow, it'll still apply to agreements that were signed at any time from May 27th last year until the law actually gets passed. So they're going to grandfather those agreements into it. Okay. So that means that once this was passed, some builders started making revisions to the agreement of purchase and sale to contemplate some of this, and we've seen that with some agreements of purchase and sale. We haven't seen it in other agreements of purchase and sale because there's some uncertainty. So it's hard, but some builders are putting in clauses. They're saying, if this legislation is passed, then blah, 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 blah. Okay. Others are not doing it, but it's one of the things we're looking at when we're reviewing pre-construction agreements of purchase and sale. Now, that's builder pre-construction. There's also a provision in the proposed legislation that will deal with owner-built homes. So owner-built homes could potentially qualify for the first-time home buyer rebate as well. So for that to qualify, an owner-built home, at least one of the owner builders would need to be a first-time home buyer that's building or hiring someone to build this new home for the use by at least by this person as their primary place of residence. Okay, so if someone bought a piece of land and wants to retain someone to build this for them, or maybe they're building it for themselves as their home, that property could potentially qualify for this rebate as well. But at least one of the owners of that property has to be a first-time home buyer. They have to go through all the other qualifying to make sure they're first-time home buyer, and they have to move in as their primary place of residence, which means if they're not moving in, they don't move in as a primary place of residence, they're just building it in order to sell it to some third party, they're not going to qualify for this rebate. So they have to actually move in. So that individual has to be the first individual to occupy. So again, they can't rent it out for a period of time and then move in themselves because they would disqualify themselves from the rebate because they wouldn't be the first individual to occupy the home as their place of residence. And again, just like before, that rebate will be available if the construction of this owner-built home begins on May 27, 2025 or after. And the construction has to start before 2031, and it has to be substantially completed before 2036. So the same criteria for a builder would be applicable to an owner-built home as well in terms of the timing for this. Okay. So any of you that have a client potentially in that situation and they're building a home for themselves, they might qualify for this rebate as well, which is not insignificant. 5% is 5% of the purchase price, okay, up to the maximum that they're allowed. Now, we also deal sometimes with cooperative housing. And when you're buying a co-op or an interest in a co-op, what you're really buying is shares in the co-op housing corporation. You're not buying the actual land. The land and the building on it and the units on it are actually owned by the cooperative housing corporation. So you're not getting registered title to it. You're really buying a share or more share or certain shares from the Cooperative Housing Corporation. Okay. But there's eligibility for this rebate in those situations too. So to qualify for this first-time home buyer rebate in a co-op, at least one of the purchasers of the shares in the co-op has to be a first-time home buyer, has to qualify under their definition of first-time home buyer. That's acquiring the share in the co-op as their principal, or sorry, their primary place of residence. Okay, same type of criteria. And that individual has to be the first individual to occupy that co-op unit as a place of residence. So just because a property is being built as a co-op doesn't disqualify it from the first-time home buyer rebate. It's still like mostly the same type of eligibility that's available when you're acquiring shares in a co-op as you would be if you were buying the freehold in a new construction property. Okay, so it's pretty much works the same way. So again, it would generally be available in a co-op if the agreement of purchase and sale to buy those shares in the co-op were entered into on May 27th or any time after, and as long as it was before 2031. And again, the construction of the co-op housing has to begin before 2031 and has to be substantially completed before 2036. So it's the same type of criteria that we have in the other ones. Okay. Now, it would not be available, the rebate would not be available for co-op shares if the co-op housing is eligible for 100% GST rebate for purpose-built rental housing. So it's an additional factor that has to come into play. We've got to make that assessment to see if it doesn't qualify that way. Now, we don't deal with a lot of co-ops. Even in our office, we're probably dealing with, like a couple a year. There aren't a lot. There might be more in the future though, because there's a bit of a push with incentives and other things to get more housing and more affordable housing. And one of the ways that that'll be facilitated would be by cooperative housing. So we might see more of this. So just keep this in mind uh, because there might be eligibility for first-time homebuyer rebate for a co-op as well. Now, as with any legislation, there's certain limitations as well um, to ensure that the rebate is available as intended to first-time home buyers. So it's going to run through some of these limitations. An individual would not be permitted to claim the first-time home buyer rebate more than once in their lifetime. Okay, you can't be a first-time home buyer more than once under this legislation. Okay. An individual would not be permitted to claim this rebate if their spouse or common law partner previously claimed the first-time homebuyer rebate. Okay, so even though they might qualify by all the parameters and you run through all the fact situation, they might end up being disqualified if their spouse or common law partner previously had claimed a rebate. Okay, the last one or it was actually there's two more. If pursuant to an assignment sale, a first-time home buyer assumes the rights and obligations of another person, that is a buyer of a new home under an agreement purchase sale with a builder, the rebate would not be available if that original agreement purchase sale was entered into before May 27, 2025. So it's not the date of the assignment that we look at. We have to see the date that the original agreement of purchase and sale was entered into with the builder in order to determine whether or not a, um, a first-time home buyer that would otherwise qualify can get the benefit of the rebate because if the original agreement of the builder was entered into prior to May 27, 2025, they wouldn't be eligible for this rebate. And the last limitation to make you aware of is if an agreement of purchase and sale for a new home was originally entered into before May 27, 25, and the agreement is subsequently canceled, and then a new agreement is entered into, or there's some sort of amendment to it or variation, the rebate will be disallowed in respect of a sale under that agreement. And this is clearly an attempt to make sure that people aren't scheming around the dates and say, "Oh, you know what? We signed an agreement for sale with the builder before May 27, 25. Therefore, for everything David told me, I wouldn't be available of it. I wouldn't be eligible for this first time rebate because we signed it before May 27, 25. So how about if builder, you agree with me, we're going to cancel that agreement, sign a new agreement for the same property on the same terms, or do an amendment to that agreement so we can get a date that's after May 27, 2025, and therefore we just schemed around the intention of the law to get 5% that we're not really entitled to, but we're fudging our documents so that we become eligible. So they're already anticipating attempts to do that. And so they're putting in something specific saying, no, don't even bother. We're on to you. We're going to be looking for that. And we don't know the documents that'll be required, but there could be sworn documents required both from the builder and from the buyer to confirm the dates that they signed the document and that there were no prior agreements and there was no prior agreements canceled, there was no amendments. The government's going to come up with something probably under oath that parties have to sign to confirm dates to make sure that if someone violates that and tries to get the 5% when they're not entitled to it, the government will have recourse against perhaps not only the buyer that's trying to get the benefit of that 5%, but they might have recourse against the builder that's cooperating with the buyer to basically defraud the government of the 5% that they're not entitled to. So we don't know exactly how it's going to look like, but we know that when they put a clause in like this, they're they're trying to anticipate attempts to scheme around the intended legislation. So we got to be careful with that. So how is this rebate being treated in agreements? So like I mentioned before, it's not law yet. It hasn't received royal assent. It's not currently in force, so we don't know exactly when it might come into force. So builders are not in a position to say, we're going to give you a credit for the amount of the rebate, or we're not going to, or they're in a bit of a holding pattern too. But some builders, like I mentioned before, are now putting in clauses that provide a conditional credit if the first-time home buyer rebate becomes effective prior to closing. And obviously, it's got to come into effect, and you still have to go through all these qualifications to make sure that it's available. So we have to take a close look at all these agreements of purchase and sale. And any first-time home buyer that you're acting for that's looking to buy a new construction or property that would qualify, you've got to make sure that you're advising them properly and that they're getting legal advice as well. Make sure they know that it's not the law yet. It's not in effect yet. The credit is not guaranteed because the government, because it's not law, the government could say, nah, forget it, we're not doing it. Or we're going to do it, but we're going to do it differently. And it's not going to be 5%, it's going to be 4%. They can make it 6%, but they could change it. There's no law yet. So we don't want our buyer clients to be making decisions based on proposed legislation that may or may not come into effect unless they're really comfortable, it's been explained to them, and they're prepared to take that risk. Okay. And if you have a client saying, I can't afford this new construction home unless I get the benefit of that 5% rebate, then you're advising them, well, don't sign it. Don't go and buy this. Let's buy something that's 5% less expensive, that will be affordable even if you don't get this rebate, or it never comes into effect, or it doesn't end up being 5%. Make sure they're buying something affordable and they're not relying on the fact that this is going to come into force and effect, because we don't know for sure. So don't put your neck on the line. Give them proper advice. Okay. All indications are they're going to pass this, but it's not certain. So that's all you have to explain to your buyer, and it's up to your buyer then to make an informed decision. I'm going to buy this property anyways. If I get the 5%, great. If they don't pass it and I never get it, I still want to go ahead and buy this property. Okay, that's the decision that they should be making with your advice. Okay, so just be careful about that. There's no guarantee this is going to happen, and we don't know if what changes might take place. Okay, so in the absence of clauses that are directly in the agreement of purchase and sale, where a builder might be giving a credit on closing, just like they do with the new housing rebate, and they give them a credit on closing, this might have to work differently, and it might be that the buyer has to close the transaction, and maybe they have to apply for a rebate to the CRA directly after closing, in which case there's a cash flow issue they should be aware of. So even if this comes into effect, it's possible that they may have to pay the full HST amount on closing. They're not getting the benefit of the 5% on closing, but after closing, they apply to the government and they get back the 5%. So they still have to lay it out, and then they have to recover it afterwards. We're not sure how that's going to work. It depends on the timing. It depends on when agreements are signed and what the builders put in their agreements of purchase and sale. And whatever they're putting in now might not work depending on how the legislation ultimately gets passed and the regulations that govern the legislation, etc. Okay, so we have to just be careful, and we have to be advising our respective clients accordingly. Like, this could be a great thing. It might be a great opportunity. It's likely you'll be able to get a 5% rebate. We're not sure if you're going to get it at the time of closing. You might have to get it after closing. You have to be able to afford this property, even if you don't get it. If it is going to be available, you have to be able to afford to pay the full amount to the builder on closing and then get the 5% back before you stick your client's neck on the line on this thing and your own neck on the line. Now, last thing I really want to tell you about. Okay, HST is the federal portion, provincial portion. Okay, 5% federal, 8% provincial, total 13%. Right now, this proposed legislation is the federal government's proposed legislation. Okay, it's Carney's Liberals proposing this legislation, and the rebate would apply to the federal 5%. So it's a 5% rebate. Now, the provincial government, Doug Ford's provincial conservative government, has also announced its plans to introduce similar rebate for the provincial portion, for that 8% portion. So that's even better news if the provincial government goes ahead with that, because if the provincial government does that too, then the rebate would be 13%, not 5%, because it'll be the 5% federal portion, it'll be the 8% provincial portion. So Ford's government's kicking this around too because they also would like to provide incentive to first-time home buyers. So and let them buy in Ontario because maybe some provinces may follow suit, some provinces might not. But if you're getting a 13% advantage by buying a property in Ontario versus buying a property somewhere else, or really be if another province that doesn't pass it, you're really getting an 8% advantage for buying in Ontario, then that'd be great for the housing industry in Ontario. So there is that potential that this could actually go up to a full HST rebate. Now, the provincial government has also made it clear that they are not going to pass an 8% HST provincial portion of HST rebate unless the federal government passes theirs first. And then they'll probably match that in terms of the timing, the dates, the qualifications, etc. There's no indication that they would change any of that. They'll just pass legislation that just mirrors the federal legislation. Says if you're eligible for the 5%, you're also eligible for the provincial 8%. Congratulations, you're going to get a 13% rebate if you qualify and the property's in Ontario. So that would be a pretty exciting development if that happens as well. Okay. And this is cooperation from a federal liberal government and a provincial conservative government that both want to provide incentives to the construction industry and to create more housing. And this all comes out of the fact that we don't have enough housing and we need more housing, and it's really hard for first-time home buyers to get in the market and get their first home. So here's some incentive, and I hope they get onto it and start passing this because there's a difference between proposed legislation and legislation that comes into force and effect when we know all the rules and regulations. So we don't know everything now. But Sabiha, I have told you what I do know, and
It's actually really good because, the questions were revolving around what you explained to us that it's after the fact, the contract which should have been signed only after May 2025 and prior to, well, we don't know, right? Because
right.
2031 maybe they extend it after or not. And the fact that they have to resign it in it, not just be a first-time home buyer, but actually reside in it. I think that's really
Yes.
important.
Yep.
I have a question. Maybe you did explain it, I missed it, but you mentioned that one of the people. So if there's because land transfer tax or all of that is like is it just that portion of the person that's buying it, or can it be a first-time home buyer who buys it with their parents? The first-time home buyer is the one who's moving in it, is also on title, and will they still get the 5%?
Yeah, it's not just about being on title. That first-time home buyer has to be the one that's actually going to live there.
Yeah. So if the
Okay.
parent is helping them buy it, is
Right.
50% on the title.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, and land transfer tax is going to be treated differently. There's
Yeah,
and there's as I guess you're alluding to land transfer tax refund that's available to first-time buyers
correct.
as well. So nothing changes with that. Okay. So if in your example, a first-time home buyer bought this new construction and a parent, was going on title with them, if the parent was going on for 50%, the first-time home buyer would be eligible for the land transfer tax refund of their 50 that applies
50%.
to
Yeah.
their 50%
Yeah.
interest. Nothing
Right.
changed there. And if it was 99% and 1%, and the first time home buyer went on title for 99%, they'd be entitled to 99% of that land transfer tax refund. Okay. A little bit different criteria here because they can still buy that property with the parent, and there's nothing in here saying it's got to be 99-1 or 50-50 or anything like that. It just said that, that one of the buyers has to be eligible for this, and that buyer that is eligible as a first-time homebuyer is the one that has to move in.
Right. So that's part of the eligibility anyways, right? The
Yes.
moving in is part of the
The moving
eligibility.
in.
But this is really good
Yes.
to know. Okay, very good.
It has to be their
For
principal
those were
place.
all the points that were in my mind, and you kind of really clarified it. And also the fact is that it's not in action right now,
Yes.
correct? So
Yeah.
we have to wait and see and make sure that we're not dependent on that 5% to actually be able to close the property.
Right. So, all indications are it's going to get passed. Um, I'm not sure what the delay is, other than the fact that Kearney doesn't have a majority government. So anytime they're passing any legislation right now, they got to make sure it's going to
Right.
pass with enough
Yeah.
support from the other parties. Otherwise, the government gets defeated.
Right.
So, they're being careful to, I'm sure to make sure that it's going to pass. And, and at the same time, it's got to be drafted. It's got to be kicked around a little bit. Changes, amendments to it, regulations have to be passed, and they got to, give us a more explanation of the process and the forms and everything about how you get the rebate. If you are eligible, is it going to be the buyer's got to pay for it all and then apply after closing to get it back, or are they going to permit some sort of deduction right on closing and determine the eligibility before closing so that the buyer doesn't have to lay out that 5% or 13% at the time of closing and then get it back. So there's still some uncertainty, but
Right.
our job is to make sure that the buyer clients are informed of what's proposed and what the risks are, and they make informed decisions.
Wonderful. Does anybody have another quick question or a couple? It was very helpful, David. Thank you so much as always. And like I said, we will be adding this to our YouTube channel. And of course, the Corman's LLP is there for you to reach out to them and ask questions if you are representing a first-time home buyer
Yep.
or anything else.
Yeah, please don't hesitate to contact me or any of the other lawyers in my office, and I will be happy to walk you or your clients through any of this.
And we look forward to at least your team seeing them at the gala and all of
Yes.
you. I hope all the realtors that are on this call are showing up for the gala, and we look forward to it.
Yeah, and my apologies that I'm not going to be able to attend that night, but we'll get at least one of my partners and another lawyer out there, and to participate, and like we always do, and we always try to. So congratulations in advance for me, for everybody that's getting an award, and hopefully everybody has a great year in 2026. So everybody gets a good award in 2027 for all your efforts in 2026. And congratulations to Sabiha for
Absolutely.
putting on the gala. I'm sure it'll be a great event. It always is. It's always a lot of fun, and I'm like, it's killing
It's
me that I'm
it's
not
a
gonna be.
really a celebration, not just for the award winners. It's a really a celebration for everybody that strived and put themselves out there. And we all
Yep.
know that that it takes time for fruition. Your all your activities will take time for them to actually materialize into to deals. It's just about being there and not giving up and putting your best foot forward. So I hope
Yep.
to see everybody show up and, just enjoy once and celebrate us.
Yeah.
So, all
Well, have
right.
a
Thank
great
you,
time,
David.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.